This is a production of Cornell University.
I'm delighted to be introducing Leland, Deladurantaye, Pheng, Cheah, and Marc Redfield, the speakers for our next panel, Theorizing Literature. Marc Redfield is a professor of English and Comparative Literature at Brown. His dissertation at Cornell on the politics of reception was completed in 1990. 6 years later, he won the MLA First Book Prize for Phantom Formations, Aesthetic Ideology, and the Bildungsroman. This indispensable book illuminates the expression aesthetic ideology and has forever made dubious the premises behind calling a work a Bildungsroman. The argument is extended and enriched in Marc Redfield's 2003 book, The Politics of Aesthetics, Nationalism, Gender, and Romanticism. Marc's next book reflects critically on the notion of a war on terror. It's called The Rhetoric of Terror, Reflections on 9/11, the War on Terror. Marc Redfield is also the editor of an important collection of essays, Legacies of Paul de Man, and has published in 2007, and he's the editor of High Anxieties, Cultural Studies in Addiction, and he's just finished a book on the Yale School, Theory at Yale, the Yale Critics, Romanticism, and Deconstruction in America. Please join me in welcoming Marc Redfield.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. My talk's going to be messier than the two talks that you've just heard, so please forgive me. It's adding to the anxiety that already prevented me from giving a coherent talk in the first place. So I'm going to actually talk about what I didn't do, what I will do, and then what I did. I'm going to summarize briefly my book that I just finished. When Jonathan invited us to speak here informally on, quote, something that particularly interests you at the moment, as he put it in the email, my first impulse was, of course, to disobey him because he had been my dissertation director, and that's what you do. And your dissertation director tells you wisely to do something. So I was going to write a formal paper because that's the form Oedipal struggle takes when you're middle-aged. And I wanted to reflect on his great essay from 1977, Apostrophe, which has been a very, very important text for me for decades. It was partly because I did want to think about those issues, but I also had come up with a great title. I was going to call it, the paper, Apostrophe 2.0. And I didn't quite know what I was going to say, but I wanted to play on the puns of 2.0 and 2.0, and I thought, how could you go wrong with this title? Except that it implicitly suggested Jonathan's classic article was Apostrophe 1.0, which I didn't want to suggest, but I figured I could finesse that somehow. However, I became chair of my department and finished a book this summer, and that never got done. So the moral is always listen to your dissertation director's advice and wing it, which is what I'm going to do. So I'll spend a couple of, maybe 1 minute talking about what I'm working on now in the sense of what I'll be doing in the future. I'm kind of between projects. My next book is probably going to be on Benjamin and Adorno. I've written some short pieces on Walter Benjamin and a longer essay on Adorno. I'm not quite sure how they all come together, but I feel that they probably will in some way. And I have a side project going that involves revisiting the question of what Susan Sontag in a famous essay called Fascinating Fascism. That is the question of what has made Nazism, which is what Sontag really means by fascism. You know, she wants the alliteration, but really she's interested in what makes Nazism a locus of fascination in post-war Western media and culture. A couple of years ago, I wrote an essay on Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Bastards and Jonathan Littell's very strange and kind of bad novel, Les Bienveillantes, the kindly ones. A bad but interesting novel, I think. And I want to keep working on that material. So those are the things I'll be doing over the next few years. I'd be happy to say more about those projects to the extent that I can. But for the remainder of my time today, so I'm going to try to keep a sharp eye on the clock and not go over, say, 16 or 17 minutes. I'll describe the book that I finished in August, which, as Cynthia told you, is titled Theory at Yale, The Yale Critics, Romanticism, and Deconstruction in America. It has chapters on the Yale critics of the 1970s, that is Harold Bloom, Jeffrey Hartman, J. Hillis Miller, Paul Duman. But it isn't a straightforward account of or engagement with their work. It's a book about the event of theory in the American Academy. And by theory, I mean something just slightly askance to the already somewhat peculiar use of the term that is now normative in the humanities in the United States, as we find it featured in our panels today, and as Jonathan's work has so fundamentally illuminated and contributed to. But I'm interested in the phantasmatic identification of theory with deconstruction that accompanied the emergence of what Jonathan has called the nickname theory in the American Academy in the 1970s. Both as a media event and more complexly as an academic one, theory was understood to be epitomized by deconstruction. That is to say, deconstruction was high theory. That's still a term that works. And deconstruction was in turn understood to be epitomized by the writings, the proper names, and the ambivalently twinned personae of Paul Duman and Jacques Derrida, especially Duman, who by the early 1980s had become something of an allegorical embodiment of high theory, which is what made possible the massive mediatization of the wartime journalism scandal at the end of that decade, and then the peculiar aftershock in this last year of the Barish biography. I'm interested in that dreamlike process of condensation and personification, and its relationship to the more normative notion of theory in the humanities, and that normative notion or nickname is already a purely North American artifact, as Derrida pointed out in his one extensive discussion of the term and notion of theory in 1987 in a paper given at Irvine. So one question I raise and try to answer is, why should theory be a peculiarly American phenomenon? And why does deconstruction come to signify high theory by the end of the 1970s and during the mass mediatization of theory in the 1980s? And what can we say about the fact that at least according to what I claim, what can we say about the fact that the mediatization of theory as deconstruction got shaped in the 1970s via the production of an ensemble of Yale critics? For that, I submit, is what happened. No normative history of literary theory would spend much time on the Yale critics, but although it would have extensive discussion of Derrida and hopefully of Duman as well. But if like me, you're interested in the mediatization of theory as deconstruction, this phantasmatic grouping of the Yale critics becomes an important symptom to think about. These individual critics leap into visibility if you go back and look at academic debates, journal articles, reviews, etc. in the 1970s. It's easy to forget how much attention Harold Bloom and Jeffrey Hartman, for instance, received as theorists during the first two-thirds of that decade. The very first issues of Diacritics, for instance, just to remind us of that great Cornell journal, in the fall of 1971, prominently feature essays by Hartman and Work in Progress by Harold Bloom, Work in Progress that would then appear in 1973 as The Anxiety of Influence. So even before that book, for which Bloom will always be remembered, there was enormous interest and chatter, as it were, about his work. And when William Pritchard denounced the, quote, hermeneutical mafia at Yale in 1975, he was attacking Hartman and Bloom, not Duman. There's a tiny little footnote to Duman and Hillis Miller, but his main anger is directed at Bloom and Hartman. By 1980, Duman, Derrida, and deconstruction had attained the role in the professional imaginary that I've been evoking. But what happened first was the production of Yale critics or Yale School, partly through articles written by Hillis Miller promoting that group, but also other figures as well. In my book, I attempt the double task of respecting the conceptual power of deconstructive writing, since that's where I come from, the tradition I come out of, on the one hand, but also I try to situate the impact of these texts within an institutional and cultural context. And my hypothesis is that a mix of cultural, institutional, and intellectual factors allowed the Yale critics to serve briefly as a lightning rod for the emergent discourse of theory. Some of the things I look at in my opening chapter, and I have to go very, very fast here, of course, are aspects of the history and structure of the American university. Peculiarities of that history and structure have resulted in a uniquely high-pitched tradition of public debate about the humanities in the United States. The elective system on the undergraduate level, the deferral in elite educational tracks of professional study to postgraduate training, the residential tradition, the early professionalization of the professoriate in the United States, and various other factors have made the teaching of the humanities in the American university a perennial subject of debate. It's bound up with the history of the American university in the 20th century. And when in one of the nation's iconic universities, Yale, a threat to aesthetic humanist education was perceived, theory as a media event became possible. Hartman and Bloom were being attacked in the mid-70s as critics who were supposedly destroying the difference between criticism and literature, criticism and poetry. And so they lent a jolt of aesthetic scandal to the emergent story about deconstruction. But eventually I claim it was because of de Mon's rhetorical critique of aesthetics, the critique of aesthetic pieties in a very direct way, that deconstruction, rather than what you might have perhaps expected, rather than Marxism or psychoanalysis or semiotics or any other approach, especially approach with a rebarbative vocabulary like semiotics, only deconstruction proved to be the ne plus ultra of theory and the tinder for a media firestorm. So that's my emphasis there is on the importance of certain kind of fantasies of aesthetic education that have been important for cultural and institutional reasons in U.S. culture, which is why we had the theory phenomenon in the U.S. in a way that still is foreign to Western European, Western European context, for instance. So, how am I doing? I'm living proof that professors keep writing the same book over and over, because this one, like most things I've written, is about rhetorical reading and aesthetics. And in the end, it's really a book about de Man and the reception of de Man. And my chapters on the other Yale critics seek to show ways in which they're ambivalently channeling and warding off the kinds of questions that de Man and Derrida address more directly and rigorously. I have a chapter on lyric, which is one of the innumerable places in my text where I draw on Jonathan's work, for he's written on every aspect of what interests me here, including the structure of the American university in the collection Framing the Sign, a very important essay. But that chapter on lyric engages J. Hillis Miller's debate with M.H. Abrams over Wordsworth's exemplary lyric, A Slumbered in My Spirit's Seal. I then have chapters on Hartman and on Harold Bloom, and a chapter on John Guillory's very powerful but I think erroneous reading of de Man. And finally, as an epilogue, I have a reading of a couple of canvases of the postmodern painter Marc Tanzi, which you know, but I thought I would show them to you as the closing thing I'll do in this talk. You all have seen this, this canvas, no doubt. So let me really quickly say why I'm showing this. The point is to demonstrate that smart reflection on theory doesn't simply happen in the academy, but that sometimes also elsewhere, in this case in the art world. Marc Tanzi in 1990 painted a sequence of paintings you could call theory paintings. They silk screen text into the background, text from one of two sources, almost in most cases, text from pages 146, 147 of Blindness and Insight, which is literary history and literary modernity. And in two cases, pages from Gayatri Spivak's translation of grammatology. So this is, of course, Derrida queries de Monde. You can see the running header Blindness and Insight going down from their bodies there. The intertext of this 6-foot-high sublime-style painting is a small magazine illustration. This is Sidney Paget's famous illustration in the Strand magazine for Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes story, The Final Problem. And Holmes and Moriarty are about to go over the Reichenbach Falls to their deaths until 10 years later, Conan Doyle brought Holmes back to life again and gave you a different story. But anyway, so you can see that Tansey has changed the disposition of the bodies, creating an ambiguous dance instead of a struggle. And the near figure de Monde has acquired a version of Holmes's devastating grip, and the far figure Derrida is slipping off balance. And of course, and the title of the painting itself is lettered, probably with a Leroy lettering machine in the painting itself. So you shouldn't necessarily trust it, but you also have to read it and go with it, as it were. Derrida queries de Monde. And of course, I have a lot to say about that, but I'm just going to give you that's the detail of the silk screening. And then very quickly here, you recognize this painting because it was on the first edition of the Norton Anthology of Criticism and Theory. This uses as a background the page of Grammatology. And here are just some other paintings from 1990 when Tansey was doing this. The other painting that I talk about is called Constructing the Grand Canyon. And here, instead of silk screening, he's used confetti strips of text to create an archive of shattered textual bits. And of course, you have the famous figures at the center. You see Derrida and de Monde with Hartmann sitting to the right and Bloom adopting a thinker's pose in front. And the reason why they're doing this is because the painting is quoting Raphael's School of Athens with de Monde and Derrida in the place of Plato and Aristotle. I'll conclude. Again, I have a lot to say about this painting. But what I think these paintings suggest is both the intellectual force and the cultural specificity of the discourse of theory. In other words, I think that's part of their theme. That is theory in America, a landscape in which Derrida and de Monde remain the mirage-like central figures. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Our next speaker is Pheng Cheah, who completed at Cornell in 1998 a groundbreaking dissertation entitled Spectral Nationality, the Idea of Freedom in Modern Philosophy and the Experience of Freedom in Postcoloniality. It was followed in 2003 by his book Passages of Freedom from Kant to Postcolonial Literature, and in 2007 by Inhuman Conditions on Cosmopolitanism and World Literature. His most recent book, What is a World? On Postcolonial Literature as World Literature, will also be published by Harvard University Press. I vividly remember Pheng's working with Jonathan on editing what was at first a special issue of Diacritics, Grounds of Comparison around the work of Benedict Anderson. A professor in the Department of Rhetoric at Berkeley, Pheng has since then edited collections entitled Derrida and the Time of the Political and Cosmopolitics, Thinking Beyond the Nation.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here to honor Jonathan and to meet old friends and to meet new friends. I think perhaps more than any other literary theorist, Jonathan Culler's work has been instrumental for disseminating the idea that literary theory is the endeavor to understand how literature works, a type of poetics as opposed to hermeneutics, The Hopkins Conference on the Languages of Criticism and the Sciences of Man debated the extension of linguistics to the human and social sciences. Culler's work, Jonathan's work, has focused specifically on the importance of the literary. In the language of phenomenology, it is the question of the genesis of significance of the processes and works we call literary. When Jonathan uses the same argument in a polemical intervention in debates surrounding world literature and comparative literature in the final chapter of The Literary in Theory, he champions the vocation of comparative literature by suggesting that it should also be modeled after a poetics, and I quote, "The attraction of comparative literature for students and teachers has been tied either to a polyglot experience or to an idea of cosmopolitanism. It is possible to take an interest in the literature of the world as a repertoire of possibilities, forms, themes, discursive practices. Comparative literature is the right place for the study of literature as a discursive practice, a set of formal possibilities, thus a poetics," end quote. When I read these lines again as I was completing my book on world literature, the question of the genesis of significance presented itself as a valuable correction to recent theories of world literature that have understood the genesis of world literature in terms of social force. So in the brief time I have, I'm going to speak a little bit about the inadequacies of the sociological approach to world literature by looking very quickly at the work of Franco Moretti, and then I will suggest that a normative theory of world literature needs to understand the literary not merely as a property of discourse, but as a structure of the worldliness of the world. Now, the defining characteristic of the world in recent accounts of world literature by people like Franco Moretti, David Damrosch, and Pascal Casanova is spatial extension. It refers to the scale of the production, circulation, consumption, and evaluation of literature. World is extension on a global scale, where world literature is conceived through an analogy with a world market's global reach. What is worldly about literature is its locomotion or movement in Mercatorian space, according to the mathematical coordinates of Euclidean geometry. Accordingly, world literature is the exchange or circulation of an object between subjects, its movement across flat spatial distance in time conceived spatially. These new theories of world literature arise in the time of the delegitimation of the humanities in universities and public consciousness in the North Atlantic, when literary studies is under pressure to justify the value of literature as an object of study, especially its efficaciousness in the production of value. While the work of a corporate lawyer, an accountant, or a software engineer has economic value because it is directly part of the process of economic production, literary criticism's role in the production process is unclear, other than the part it may play in the generation of cultural capital and more indirectly in social reproduction and the augmentation of human capital. Exploring how a global approach can transform the parameters and object of literary studies and the bearing of globalization on the normative implications of literary studies may be a fruitful way of bringing out literature's causal relation to our contemporary existence. Literature's worldly force would then be how it operates as a real object of exchange and circulation in the world to constitute a world of its own that transcends national boundaries. However, instead of affirming the causal power of literature, this analogy with global commodity exchange diminishes its force in relation to the world that globalization creates. To think of world literature's dynamics in terms of those of a global market is precisely to think of world literature as mimicking global processes, of being a displaced and delayed communication of socio-economic forces at work in the real world. Literature's worldliness would derive from its being a passive reflection of the forces at work in a global market in the specificity of its own sphere. Now, the primary allure of metaphors of circulation and commerce for understanding literature's worldliness is the promise of negative freedom. The liberation from a national framework stifling strictures on appreciating and studying literature and the reductive aesthetic and evaluative criteria imposed by ossified national literary traditions on writers and the public criticism of literature. Just as contemporary global markets and the liberalization of trade and financial flows have brought about the corrosion of national state-regulated economies and the thorough privatization of the means of production, and the revolution in technology and communications has undermined state control over information and knowledge, thereby leading to genuinely global economic interdependence as opposed to the independent sovereignty of national state economies, so too the globalization of literary exchange and production is set to lead to the emergence of world literature, a form of literature that has rendered merely national literature obsolete and illusory. The world is therefore an adjective attached to qualify the noun literature. It contrasts world literature with merely national literature. Now, the main problem with this approach is that it takes the world for granted. It conflates the world with the globe and reduces it to a spatial object produced by the material processes of circulation, global circulation. Now, the work of Franco Moretti is the best example of this taking of the world for granted. What Moretti does is to literalize the market metaphor. He examines how market forces, such as printing presses, readers as paying consumers, libraries, channels of circulation, and so on, create the concrete material conditions of literary production. Literary intercourse and production require market forces in order to take place. By the same token, the generation of literary meaning and cultural value is not merely similar to the processes of commodification and capitalization. Literary works are literally made as goods for exchange in a mass market for pecuniary profit. Accordingly, Moretti extends world literature's scope to include middle and lowbrow books. He also pays greater attention to form, which he understands through an analogy with the biological forms or morphological arrangements studied by evolutionary science. Now, you would logically expect from this that world literature would possess a greater force. But Moretti's account diminishes the force of literature even further because his literalization of the market metaphor reduces literature to a refraction of social forces. Now, his view of literature is informed by a Marxist base superstructure model, and it is condensed in a provocative claim, and I quote, that form is a diagram of forces, and perhaps even is nothing but force. This, in his view, is what he calls a materialist conception of form. Form as the most profoundly social aspect of literature, form as force, end quote. Form refers primarily to genre. Moretti is interested in the popularity of certain genres, the historical fact of their survival, and therefore their hegemony over other genres in competitive market relations. The measure of a genre's force is not its aesthetic value, but the quantity of books that are published. The survival of literary form, he explains the survival of literary forms as follows. Literary forms are a schematic distillation or structural reduction of social forces, which they express and represent in a symbolic medium. This is a social psychology of the reader as a consumer of texts. The success of these forms in their circulation as commodities in the print market of publishers and readers, sellers and consumers, is measured in terms of the loyalty, size, and reach of a reading public. There is a fit or adequacy of the form to the specific problems raised by social relations in the market area in a given period. There are here three different levels of sociality. Literary forms are symbolic representations of social relations, but as commodities, they belong to the social intercourse of print market relations. Finally, these markets are embedded in a larger set of social relations with their specific problems. The survival of a literary form depends on the congruence between these different levels of sociality. Moretti calls this congruence artistic usefulness, a term that he borrowed from Victor Shklovsky. It designates literature's functionality for a social subject who takes pleasure in a work because its formal devices resolve at an imaginary level a fundamental contradiction structural to the social dynamics that organize his existence. In Moretti's words, and I quote, literary genres are problem-solving devices. which address a contradiction of the environment, offering an imaginary resolution by means of their formal organization. The pleasure provided by the formal organization is therefore more than just pleasure. It is the vehicle through which a larger symbolic statement is shaped and assimilated. The structure provided makes readers feel that the world is fully understandable, end quote. But this means that a literary form's capacity to survive, its conatus, if you will, is entirely derivative. Literary form has no force of its own. As a symbolic expression of social relations, it is merely a relay of social forces. Moreover, a representation's effectiveness in arousing pleasure depends on its fit with the social context of the reading public. Therefore, the primary ground of literature's force is the play of social forces at work in the constitution of readers, or more precisely, the contradictions of their social environment and the existential problems they generate. Literary form is merely a tool for expressing social relations, which are the inner truth of the form. These relations explain why a form survives, and the survival of a form, in turn, confirms the primacy of social forces. Moretti's emphasis on literature's symbolic function is significant here. The natural motivation between the symbol and what it represents supports the view that literary forms are mere tools for the imaginary resolution of social contradictions. What then of the agency of the reader's imagination or interpretive powers? It turns out that the reader is no better off. Both the literary text and the reader are simply dummies through which social forces are ventriloquized. Since the reader's pleasure in literature is that of a consumer, it is merely a social pleasure and desire. Because the reader-consumer is a cipher for the transmission of social forces, his desire is reactive in the Nietzschean sense. Therefore, although Moretti posits a direct causal link between literature and the world of social forces, world literature, in fact, has no transformative agency in the world. A work of world literature merely acts by reflecting and refracting the stronger primary social forces operative within it and to which its form corresponds via a natural symbolic relation. And this is why Moretti favors distant reading and explanation over close reading and interpretation. Distant reading presupposes the derivative character of literary representations and explores how their reception and consumption is determined by social forces. Close reading requires attention to literature's force of signification, how it moves readers in singular experiences of reading that point to the opening of other worlds. Recent accounts of world literature have failed to attend to two related issues. First, the question, what is a world? Or more precisely, whether the world is a normative or a merely descriptive category, and second, literature's causality in relation to the world. Yet unless world literature's normative dimension is broached, it can only be a very weak causal force in the world. The neat conflation of the world with market processes of global extensiveness conveniently hides the need to address these issues because it makes the meaning of world self-evident. But does the market create a world? And if so, how exactly? If we assume that the freeing of trade beyond national borders creates a sense of membership in a world, then is the world merely a form of intercourse that exceeds the boundaries of the territorial state? Or does world have a normative meaning? Is market exchange the sole paradigm and privileged model of worldliness, or is it only a specific type of worldliness? In what way is literature as a process of signification related to the opening and making of a world? These questions are crucial to any rethinking of world literature because unless they are broached, world literature is only of the world in a limited sense. It is affected by worldly forces, but it cannot be a force in the ongoing cartography and creation of the world by negotiating with and contesting the world brought about by commercial intercourse, monetary transactions, and flows of global mass culture. Now, literature, I want to suggest, has a more intimate connection to the world if we understand the world as a temporal category and not merely as an objective container of the greatest possible extension for human beings and things. Before the world can appear as an object, it must first be. As Heidegger puts it, why something at all and not nothing? A world's unity and permanence is premised on the persistence of time. We are only in a world, we are only worldly beings if there is already time. The concept of worlding, Welten, connects the normative force of the world to literature. originating from Heidegger's critique of the vulgar concept of the world, that is, the world as the sum totality of objects in space, and the world as something created by communication and discursive exchange between human subjects. Worlding refers to how a world is held together and given unity by the force of time. By giving rise to existence, temporalization whirls a world. Accordingly, worldliness is the sheer force of opening that inheres in the coming of time. An old friend of many of us, Gayatri Spivak, who was also a Cornell PhD, introduced the term to post-colonial theory as shorthand to describe how European imperialist cultural representations constructed the geography of colonies. Referring to Heidegger's The Origin of the Work of Art as the source of the idea of the worlding of a world upon which what must be assumed to be uninscribed earth, she suggested that these processes of imperialist discursive cartography, which include canonical literature, are a form of epistemic violence that shapes how colonized subjects see themselves and continue to play a role in the worlding of the Third World and its native inhabitants after decolonization. However, for Heidegger, a world is precisely what cannot be represented on a map. Worlding is not a cartographical process that epistemologically constructs the world by means of discursive representations, but a process of temporalization. Cartography reduces the world to a spatial object. In contradistinction, worlding is a force that subtends and exceeds all human calculations that reduce the world to the sum of objects in space. Imperialist cartography is such a calculation in the sphere of geopolitical economy. It constructs a world insofar as its discursive representations enable us to determine and shape the world that temporalization opens up. Processes of discursive construction are worldings in a derived sense. They imbue the objective world with value and significance, but they are also processes of unworlding because by reducing the world to something spatial, they obscure its worldliness. What, then, is the connection between literature and the normative force of worlding, such that we can speak of world literature as literature that whirls a world? Spiritualist and idealist accounts of the world, Goethe, Kant, and Hegel, suggest that as an aesthetic and cultural process, literature creates a higher spiritual world. In contradistinction, Marx's materialist account of the world deprives literature of any worldly normative force because it views spiritual processes as phantomatic superstructures that are devoid of efficacy in making the real world. Marx's critical theories of space and critical geography, such as the work of Henri Lefebvre and David Harvey, go some way towards a materialist understanding of literature's power to shape the world through representational cartography, because they offer a dynamic account of the making of space that gives an important role to cultural and aesthetic processes. However, in the final analysis, this shaping is directed at the world as something spatial. In contradistinction, literature has a more fundamental relation to the world in phenomenological and post-phenomenological accounts. The world's reality is neither objective nor subjective because it is a process grounded in the force of temporalization. Literature has a similarly curious ontological status. It is not objective, it's not something objective, and so cannot be reduced to the subject's rational powers of determination and calculation. Its radical indeterminacy also means that it exceeds the subject's powers of interpretation. We can say, half in jest, that the question of the genesis of literature, why is there still this thing called literature in our age of advanced tele-techno-mediation, is a simulacrum of the question of why there is something at all and not nothing. Literature does not merely map the spatialized world and give it value and meaning. Rather, its formal structures enact the opening of a world by the incalculable gift of time. We may therefore speak of the world as having a literary structure that is more infrastructural, to adopt Marx's language, than the material reality of economic production. A given work of world literature is thus the locus where different processes of worlding are played out in a historically specific field of forces, and we should analyze the complex relations, antagonisms, and aporetic tensions between these processes. We can then understand world literature as a literature that is of the world, not a body of timeless aesthetic objects or a commodity-like thing that circulates globally but something that can play a fundamental role in the ongoing creation of the world. The connections between world literature and cosmopolitanism have not been sufficiently explored because neither field of study has carefully examined the key concept common to them, the world. The world, in normative sense, refers to the being with, Mitsein of all peoples, groups, and individuals. It is the original openness that gives us accessibility to others so that we can be together. Global capitalism, however, incorporates peoples and populations into the world system by tethering them to Western modernity's unrelenting march of progress and capitalist time, as exemplified by Greenwich Mean Time. It violently destroys other worlds and their temporalities. Attempts to characterize contemporary literature as cosmopolitan on the basis of the global character of literary production, circulation, and style only lead to a facile cosmopolitanism devoid of normative force. So I hope I've proposed a little more rigorous way of understanding world literature's normativity as a modality of cosmopolitanism that responds to the need to remake the world as a place that is open to the emergence of peoples that globalization deprives of world. Thank you.
And finally, I'm happy to welcome back to Cornell Leland Deladurantaye, professor of literature at Claremont and from 2003 to 2011 at Harvard. Leland's remarkable writing while he was studying for his PhD at Cornell culminated in 2002 in his dissertation, Humbert's Green Lane, Aesthetics and Ethics in Vladimir Nabokov. Some of you will remember his return in 2009 as a key participant in the colloquium on Agamben, organized by our colleague Kevin Attell. Leland Deladurantaye is the author of Giorgio Agamben, A Critical Introduction, published by Stanford University Press in 2009, and of Style is Matter, The Moral Art of Vladimir Nabokov, published at Cornell in 2007. Leland's third book, Beckett's Art of Mismaking, is forthcoming from Harvard this year.
Thank you, Cynthia, for that introduction. I'm going to begin and probably end by stating the obvious. I'm here, quite obviously, thanks to Jonathan, in a variety of ways. The most proximate way is I assume that he had something to do with my invitation, or at least some veto right. And so in a very immediate sense, there is that. But that's, of course, not the only one, nor even approaching the most important. The reason that I am where I am, the reason that I do what I do, is because he did what he did and does. And that as well on a number of levels. That is, in reading Jonathan's books before I came to grad school, first saw a model of method that was so powerful for me and so entrancing that I wanted to make my life of it. That model was then concretized by, like Martin, having the great good fortune of coming to study with Jonathan, and Jonathan being the principal reason for my coming to Cornell and studying. And so thanks to his teaching, then in that next sense, I am where I am. What I'm going to talk about very briefly is method. When Jonathan asked me, as he asked many of you, what I might speak about, I got by with answering method and then giving a cryptic sentence in German. Methode ist Erlebnis, which is a phrase that Leo Spitzer liked to quote, which he himself took from Friedrich Gundolf, Weimar era critic of Shakespeare in German, and other things, a member of the Stefan George Kreis. And the things that were appealing to me about this phrase, Methode ist Erlebnis, method is experience, are, on the one hand, that could mean very nearly nothing. That is, method means path or way, as you all know, and experience literally means passing through. And so if a method is a manner of passing through, then you're not being told a great deal by Gundolf or by Spitzer or by me. If, however, method is experience in the sense that your method is constantly a function and a factor in your experience, then it's another thing entirely. It's arguably the most important element of work in the humanities. And so when Jonathan asked me and I blithely replied method, it wasn't so blithe at all. That is, that I didn't know what I was going to say. I don't know that I know right now. But I knew that's what I would need to talk about because I knew that was in the most fundamental sense what I learned from him. I remember quite clearly reading Structuralist Poetics in 1994 and saying to myself something I didn't say out loud for many years, which is, that's how I want to write when I grow up. Thought it over and over again. It meant many things for me, of course. It meant I envied and admired the mastery of it, the range of it, the clarity of it, the depth and breadth of it. That was strong. I wanted to be strong like that. But I also wanted to be fair like that. And recently I mentioned this first response or first intuition, my strongest memory of the book, such that I remember where I was when I was reading the book, and this thought that I was having again and again as I was reading it. But I didn't remember the book very well, because I was thinking so much about the method that I couldn't assimilate all that that method was allowing Jonathan to explore. And so as I was reading back over it, I was reminded of this idea that that was what I wanted to write like when I grew up. And I mentioned it to two former Cornell faculty members in different cities, Gordon Teskey and Marc Seltzer, who both send their greetings and envy me my honor, they both said. And one of them said, yes, Jonathan's an adult. And the other said, Jonathan's a writer. Both could have been kindly patronizing responses to my very childish statement. But it was very clear to me in the ways that they said those things, that they meant very different things entirely. Being an adult, that what that meant were a whole range of intellectual and institutional behaviors. It meant a whole way of approaching one's writing. Saying that Jonathan is a writer is also a banal biographical fact, in the same way that saying he's an adult is a banal biographical fact. But it's the most fundamental thing of all, because it's the thing that methodologically, that personally, that intellectually most influenced me and most influences me, is that there's no writing up in his writing. There is always a work of writing, and there is his writing, which is so phenomenally clear, which treats questions of causality with an unparalleled delicacy. Even when he's examining writing that, by all accounts, would be considered very flawed. So, for example, in an essay called Bad Writing and Good Philosophy from 2003, Jonathan tackles the formidable challenge of parsing some extremely difficult sentences, one singled out by another as arguably bad writing, an example drawn from Judith Butler's writing, and an example that Jonathan himself takes from Cavell. And in both cases, the sentence makes extreme demands on your sense of the flexibility of causal relations between the elements in it. It's what makes them arguably bad sentences. That is, the causal relationships, between the elements are not clear. And in reading those quotations alongside of Jonathan's expositions of them, and his own, in the context of his own prose, I realized that that never happens. And what a huge achievement that is, and how incredibly hard that is, at least for me, in my writing, to have causal relations be clear, because that is thought itself when you're thinking about the relations between say, hermeneutic problems and problems of poetics, or for that matter, virtually any problem, how the parts relate together, how the parts of your writing relate together. And so in those respects, he was a model, and is a model to me. One is aspirational, and that is, I wish for such felicity of phrasing. I wish for such wit. I wish for such subtlety, knowing full well that I won't attain it, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have an important striving element. As well as charity, clarity, and real curiosity about the most difficult relations between elements in the literary sphere. It means making very adult assessments of arguments that you could dismiss because they have flaws, because they're not written clearly, because they don't establish clear criteria for evaluation. And that is the thing that I've most learned and that I've most profited from. And so, given the various risks of speaking in public, speaking in such an occasion, of expressing, of over-expressing, or making over-explicit, or not making explicit enough, or simply having something remain implicit, that this writing has been a model for me. This has been a model of thinking that never ceases. I chose to err on the side of explicit, and so I am truly here, thanks to Jonathan's, not only his invitation, but for the encouragement and the inspiration of a manner of writing over a long time and in a huge variety of fields, always committed to clarity, to being able to say, if you really understand something, then conceptually you should be able to see it from all its sides. You should be able to state it in your own terms. When you have, that many times I thought I understood things in, say, in the first class that I took with Jonathan, Baudelaire, and I realized that I hadn't really seen it from so many sides. I'd seen one side of it, so I thought I could grasp it. But that I knew that that was always not enough for him, because that was never the way that he worked. He had to be able to state it in other terms that were true to it, compatible with it, and allowed one to compare those claims with claims in other domains, which seemed to me the condition of possibility for the incredible breadth of his interests and his mastery. So that I can say quite happily the same thing that I said to myself in 1994, that is how I want to write when I grow up, still today. Thank you.
You talk about the specifically American context of literary theory, and I was wondering if you could describe what you see as the specifically American versions of the aesthetic education that Mon, for example, is putting into question. So critical trends, etc., modes of reading in America or American institutions. And the second is, how do you see the role of theory and its development, debates, etc., in relation to the specific institutional formations of, for example, departments such as English and comparative literature? My memory at Yale, those were the ones I was involved in, not as much as French, was that it was tied up with the conflict between departmental formations, although Bloom was and was not in English, right? He was a university professor, but he was originally in English, Hartman. But conflict seemed to be the site in many ways. They're conflictual. So I'm wondering if you could comment on those two aspects.
I'll try. There's so much to say, and I'll probably get bottled up and say the wrong part of what I would want to emphasize if I could think more, because these are such complex questions. Let me start with the second one while I have it in my head. I think that the sort of the moment of theory coincided with Comp Lit, Department of Comparative Literature, for obviously for certain contingencies of certain powerful figures being in that department, but also because the theoretical texts that were being brought into the discursive space that acquired the nickname theory were coming from other languages, above all French, and they were not translated. And so there was a period of time when, if you wanted to be cognizant of what Derrida was writing, you had to actually read it in French. This no longer this is a generational marker in a sense. The foreignness of theory, which is part of the let's say the discourse of theory, and I'm not the only one, but as I use this phrase in my book, meaning by discourse of theory both what theorists actually say and write, but also what is said and right about them. So what I'm interested in is the crazy mediatizing or the powerful work of mediatization that occurs around this body of text, which makes for, of course, very erratic and strange and, in a certain sense, false statements, but structural repetitions of falsity that therefore have something to say about whatever the discourse of theory is. And part of that, of course, is the foreignness of theory, which also, of course, can be translated as the hyper-Americanness of theory, that Demond domesticates Derrida, which is one of the leitmotifs of those kinds of theoretical arguments, and yet that domestication has the strange effect of making Demond all the more charged as a figure of high theory. So that's the kind of phantasmatic work that I'm trying to approach in this text. And Kathy, you had a first question,
yes,
but I can't.
What you saw is specifically the American versions of aesthetic education as modes, for example, modes of reading, traditions of reading, that Demond was putting into question when he was questioning aestheticization of literary texts and so on. Were there particular traditions that you think of, like new criticism or whatever, that you see him in relation to?
Well, certainly the new criticism forms part of what I'm talking about, partly because that too became co-opted as part of the ambivalent discourse of theory. Is this more new criticism? Is this new criticism? And what does that mean? It always comes back to an ambivalence about the aesthetic, about what it means to read. And the accusation will be that this is an aestheticization of the text, but what is wrong with that? What kind of issues get involved? Specific traditions within the American context certainly include the new criticism, but also include the material structure of the American university, which is quite unique, right, as a hybrid of residential college, graduate training, sports facility. The American university is a very peculiar institution that again, as I said in my brief comments, has generated a history of anxious comment about teaching of the humanities and what it ought to do, how it ought to provide humane content for an increasingly technologized world.
I see. So that's already even the notion of the humanities institution as it's positioned institutionally as part of that aesthetic education.
Yes. This is the whole idea of having debates about the humanities. It seems to me is a very specifically American tradition.
This is a question for Pheng Cheah. There's such an elegant refusal or rejection of the notions of genre and form as they occur in Moretti's work, and I'm wondering, this is very open-ended, how you see genre in relation to your notions of world literature. I'm thinking a little bit of Y.G. Dimmock's sense that we can remap genre once we think in terms of world literature. I don't suspect that's exactly where you take it, in part because she sees kind of epic as a kind of trans-oceanic epic rooted in, I mean, that is in Homer too, as world literature. So that might not be where you want to go, but I'm just curious open-endedly how you see genre and form changing as concepts. Or
I guess with these kinds of spatial accounts of genre, what you do get is something that is more diverse than the normal Eurocentric thing about, you know, the birth of the novel being in Europe and then it's exported elsewhere and so on. But what primarily interested me in Moretti's account of genre is that he primarily talks about the force of genre in terms of its survival, and that he computes this, I mean, quite mathematically, in terms of how many readers read things and why during a certain period the Künstlerroman is more popular or the picaresque novel is more popular and so on. So it was primarily this notion of, you know, its survival or its strengths that interested me. And I wanted to think about this notion of what exactly is the causality that he has in mind when he talks about the worldliness of the novel that way. And it didn't seem to me to work out. I mean, in the book, I primarily talk about narrative literature because narrative is the form, it's not a genre, it's the form in which the question of the giving of time comes to the fore, because the question of narrativity comes to the fore. And then finally, I talk about the revival in many of these post-colonial novels of the story form. The odd thing that these are novels, but they pretend to be stories. And why is it that they pretend to be stories? Because I think stories, even more so than novels, bring to the fore the narrativity of the world.
This is a question that I think touches on all of your papers and allows me also to introduce a couple of other texts of Jonathan's to the table that I didn't get a chance to mention earlier, in order to have us thinking about where we are now with the status of close reading, and also what happens if we remind ourselves that in Jonathan's work, actually the capital T theory is often specifically literary theory, so what happens when we keep that adjective in the picture. And I want to just invoke Beyond Interpretation, the essay that was in The Pursuit of Signs, which had quite a profound impact on me because it freed me up not to do close reading. So some of, for example, what I was talking about, archival practice and method, I see as building off of the kinds of arguments that Jonathan makes about the use of theory to do something other than the work of interpretation. At the same time, of course, that much of his work also helps us to become better close readers or to encourage us to do close reading. In fact, I teach also a recent ADE bulletin essay that's part of a cluster on close reading, and Jonathan's piece in there is called The Process of Close Reading, and it's very much in dialogue, I think, with things like Moretti's call for distant reading. So clearly there remains a kind of salience to the practice of close reading that many of us were encouraged to do and to learn to do very well here. And I love that tension between taking Jonathan's work away from close reading as well as bringing it back to it. I think it has a lot to do with questions of where the literary and the aesthetic land, circa 2014.
I mean, in my view, distant reading is not reading, it's bean counting. Because you're really looking at it from some kind of highly removed perspective, and you're just counting numbers. And I mean, I suppose Stanford has that kind of funding where they can fund all these graduate students to go and do the counting. And it's really that kind of thing that Franco is doing. As far as the notion of keeping the literary in, I think that is very, very important. I mean, this is, I think, the notion of, in Jonathan's, in the literary, in theory, he talks about how important it is that, ironically, when one focuses on literary theory, then the literary becomes expanded so that it becomes a property of discourse in general, right? What I tried to do here was to talk about how the literary might be a property or characteristics of something that's even extra discourse speak, and then one would then be moving into the Derrida sense of the text in general, which is more than just discourse. right? But on the one hand, I think that's very important. On the other hand, I think it's also important, because this is our craft, that we insist on the specificity of literature, right? And I guess it's something that's, you can find many explanations, sociological explanations, for why people write literature, right? That you can make money, you can be a good writer, and so on. But finally, there is no real answer to the question. So that's why, for me, the question, why is there still this thing called literature, is a simulacrum of the Heidegger question. Why is there something and not rather nothing?
Just as a tiny afterthought to that, one of the ways in which I think that Gordon Teskey was saying that Jonathan is an adult is the sense of that certain things that were said to be in eclipse, such as the literary or theory or comparative literature, if looked at with adult, calm objectivity, they've ceased to be an intensely contentious item, but they've, in a certain sense, won. They've won they have come to be an utterly established practice, such that distant reading is an incredibly bizarre idea for almost everyone that first hears it. It has the allure of scientificity, and so that you can, but the close reading also is something that, far from being eclipsed, perhaps is alive and well, or is present so much that it's not contentious, that it's not dramatized as a site of danger, of falling into an abyss of nihilistic semiotic uncertainty or whatever is represented there. That sounded dismissive. I think that's an amazing painting. I like it very much. But that is that many of the things that seem to have be in abeyance or in eclipse have simply changed form, and that the problem isn't intellectual now, it's institutional. The institutional support of the institutional questions around comparative literature are burning because they haven't profited from their success in a certain way. And so that the switch of questions are one of the things that I found particularly interesting in Jonathan's more recent writing is institutional discussions in the context of these intellectual debates, not as separate ones, but as flowing seamlessly into one another and being parts of the same question.
I was just coming back to Marc, and thanks for that fascinating survey of the early 70s. I'm remembering better the 90s, and I don't know how different the 90s is from the 70s in your history. But what I remember from the culture wars of the 90s is a trope they kept, or a caricature that kept recurring and recurring, and it was an internally contradictory stereotype, which was on one hand deconstruction, which was, I think, the term of choice for the mass media attacks, was on the one hand dangerous in a certain sense. Dangerous, why? Well, because somehow there was Marxism in there too. I mean, you couldn't really get tired of it. So it was, on the one hand, it was a dangerous, radical, right? But on the other hand, it was incomprehensible. And if you remember how relentlessly that was pushed, you had anti-theory people, and I won't mention any names, some of them are well known here, would say, nobody knows how to define deconstruction. It's so hard to define. I've talked to 30 people, and they don't even know what deconstruction is. They cannot tell you the answer. And to me, that was a potent polemical combination. Something can't be both dangerous and incomprehensible. But in a certain fantasy, it was. I suppose Marx's Capital would be an example of something that was both. It was very hard to imagine something being both utterly beyond human comprehension because it was so woolly, and yet watch out for it because it signals the end of. And that was that trope that went over and over again. And it feels to me, thinking about that now, that it is. Yeah, I really love the context that you put into the crisis in humanities, but it feels to me that tax ultimately, as you look back through 20 years of underfunding of higher education, it looks to me like an anti-intellectual attack of a fairly basic, but especially potent kind that affects, of course, everything that we do in the academy and beyond. That is to say, intellectuals finally are a combination of danger and incomprehensibility. I mean, I wonder, does that impression of mine, which is only an impression, kind of connect with any of the themes that you've noted?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, sure. Intellectuals have been considered incomprehensible and dangerous, I suppose, since Socrates was put to death, right? I mean, it's a very long tradition. It acquires particular salience in the theory scandal because, at least the way I read it through a sort of ultimately Demontian lens, there's an anxiety about language and the humanity of language and the controllability of language at the heart of the theory scandal. What I'm interested in is the very powerful acts of personification that emerge out of that anxiety. The two that I spend most time with, of course, on the one hand, Demon, but I'm also very interested in Harold Bloom. And that I didn't have time to mention this, but the chapter I have on Harold Bloom is really interested in the way in which he became a media figure in the 1990s as the embodiment of the Western canon. So he went from being a theoretical scandal in the 1970s with the anxiety of influence material and the incomprehensibility of that writing, which was a good part of what someone like William Pritchard is angry about in 1975. He went from that to being the canon incorporate. And why is he the canon incorporate? Because he has it memorized. Because of the phenomenal memory of Harold Bloom, which is always part of the anecdote that circulates in this personification process of personification. So again, it's an anxiety about archival systems, right? And what finally makes us human, which is what art is supposed to do, and which it's always doing, but also doing other things.
I had a question for Pheng mostly. That was a wonderful talk, and I'm eager to read the book. But one of the things that I found most provocative in your argument was your appeal to normativity, which for me both raises a lot of questions and was also kind of alluring, right? If we think about, how theory has influenced us all, right? We would all agree that it's trained us to be wary about claims to normativity, right? So I guess first question would be, what are you trying to achieve with your appeal to normativity? Are you trying to, challenge or take issue with that kind of more skeptical posture towards such claims? And then secondly, appeals to normativity seem especially, problematic in crafting a definition of world literature, which first and foremost is about not erasing cultural difference, right, and not falling victim to the colonizing accounts of that field that you were objecting to. So if you could just say a bit more about how one comes up with a normative definition of world literature that still preserves, right?
The facile answer is I purposely put the word there because of Franco. I gave a version of, many years ago, I gave a version of this as the Laura Romero lecture at Stanford. And after the talk, Franco said to me that he thought about literary studies as a kind of social science. And it's all about empirical evidence. There are no normative claims in social science, right? So partly, in memory of that event, I purposely insisted on the word normativity. But the second reason is, for a large part of the book, when I talk about these philosophies of the world, the word normative is used in scare quotes, because certainly after Marx, the notion of anything being a norm, anything being a matter of right, is put in scare quotes. And certainly with people like Heidegger, that's even more the case. On the other hand, the question is also to look at the ground of the normative, so to speak, right? Because if you think about the world, and you think about the world as openness itself, or the opening that gives us access to other beings and to other humans and so on, right? Then it's not exactly normative in the say the Frankfurt School sense, or that comes out of that Germanic tradition. But on the other hand, it's also not unrelated to it, because it's the ground that enables that kind of relation to happen.
Cheah.
Yeah, I was really interested in the distinction that you made between the spatial and the temporal, and how you pulled the temporal back to kind of contest a certain kind of localization of the global. And it brought up something that I was really interested in terms of Marc's discussion. And maybe I can just ask all of you, it's just so interesting always been to me, Marc, how the articulation of American theory has been spatialized to a certain extent, and it was spatialized through the Yale School. And that spatialization, to a certain extent, then somewhat forgets about other American legacies. I'm thinking of the importance of San Diego and Marcuse's discussions with Dissertaro, Marin, Lyotard, or the place of Foucault in Berkeley, the rise of French feminism and how French feminism gave birth to, say, Camera Obscura in Berkeley, or Sam Weber's dialogues with Adorno and Derrida. So I was curious if you would have something to say about just how interesting it is that localization of the literary tended to grab the national attention to a certain extent, and then what it to a certain extent distracting from the multiplicities of the theoretical that were so prevalent in this country through the reading of philosophy, the articulation of French feminisms, the rise of cinema studies, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I'll answer very quickly and then turn it over. I couldn't agree with you more. The notion of the Yale School, that spatializing of theory is it's a fantasy. It's a way of giving a face and airbrushing out a vast array of spatial as well as intellectual complexities. That's the whole, in a sense, force and violence, as well as finally the interest, in a way, of that mediatic moment, or mediatizing moment. And I have to say I owe a lot to Sam Weber in my thinking about how media works in this way, since you mentioned another place where theory happened. Yes, what was I going to say?
Maybe how hard it is for you to resist. This is just a question, but it's related. How difficult is it for you to resist the appeal of that story, of that narrative, of that myth? The reason that place won out in the popular imagination is because it had it had an incredibly rich array of narrative elements. It's this incredibly prestigious and conservative place, this incredibly unlikely group of people that seem to have an undefinable school and commonality of thought, and of course that captivates the media attention and away the world goes. You are writing about it on a much deeper level, at once, of course, theoretical and sociological, but do you have to resist the appeal of telling such a good yarn, such a good tale?
Yes, sure. You get I don't know if it's a good yarn, but you get captured by that imaginary totality that you're also seeking to share.
Okay, this question for Pheng. I largely agree with your critique of Moretti, so I think that makes a lot of sense. However, I'm sort of slightly troubled about the way in which literature as an object is itself a product of a certain moment in time. And romantic aesthetics is behind Heidegger's notion of world. And also the reliance on narrative seems to be the thing that temporality or temporalization as a process tends to want to universalize. And so the idea of world literature relies so much on novels. And even if there are other forms of literature that can be thought about. But the thing is, if you introduce temporalization into the picture, you have to think about speed. And literature as an object of world speed. Yeah. Literature as an object of world time is particular to a certain moment before the new media. I mean, novels are replaced by films are replaced by video games. It's not that we can't still study novels, but the game has gone somewhere else, even though, what we do is kind of, antiquarian in a certain way, and it's a really good form of meditating on what the thing is. But I think an analysis of speed it's not that everything is sequential, but because, as we know, there was a huge interest in poetry after 9/11, after there was, big sort of moment like that. So I'm wondering, what would your defense of staying with narrative be? Because to some degree, you're avoiding the question of slow food, slow time, etc., etc. Because I think in some ways narrative is the thing that is the most universal, because people like to tell stories, and they use different media to be able to do that. But poetry is I think truly maybe the thing that is unique to, and I think maybe Jonathan's next book on the theory of lyric will explain this.
Well, I mean, there is also, of course, narrative poetry, but for instance, one of the novels that I look at is Amitav Ghosh's The Hungry Tide, and it is a novel, but incorporated in it are massive citations of Rilke's Duino elegies. So in that sense, then, I mean, the notion of the literary in general as the opening of a world is not limited to the narrative form. It's just that because the narrative form foregrounds the notion of temporality, I gave it a certain privilege in the book. But sorry, there was another aspect of your question. Speed. Yes. And partly also in response to Tim, perhaps I can put these things together. The people that the triumvirate of Pascal, Franco, and David, the two people they cite the most in order to put forward this spatialized notion of the world are Goethe and Marx. But in fact, if you look at both Goethe and Marx, and their reading is, how shall one put it in a nice way, at best superficial. The way that if you look at Goethe and Marx, of course, Goethe, and you see this in the subsequent theories of world literature in an earlier period, people like Auerbach and so on, they tied the notion of world literature to world history. So obviously for Goethe, the notion of world also has a temporal horizon, to use a Husserlian word. This is also the case in Marx. One assumes that because Marx spoke about the world market, that he had a spatialized conception of the world. But in fact, if you look at his writings, what was most important was not the breaking down of spatial barriers, but the breaking down of temporal barriers. Because if you increase the range of the world market, what you then have is the increase of circulation time. So what must happen is the destruction of space by time, right, which David Harvey talks about in terms of space-time compression. Now, the word that Marx uses to describe this, he says, Zeitraum must be reduced to the minimum. So this is the question of speed, right? But once again, with Marx, when you consider speed in terms of the time you take to traverse space, you already have a spatialized notion of time, right? So it is only with Heidegger that this spatialized notion of time is put into question as being subsidiary and so on. So I think the whole question of speed is very important, but then once again, the question is what opens up speed, what enables speed, right? And this is where the literary, I think, has something special to say about.
I have a comment that might be of interest to Marc, and then a question for Pheng. The comment is that contemporaneous with the rise of theory, literary theory here, there's the rise of a certain kind of theory in the general discourse of the humanities and social sciences in Britain. And that is also influenced by a French theorist, but that's somebody who taught Foucault, that's Althusser. And there's actually a full-blown debate. It comes to an end there, because of the full-blown debate between E.P. Thompson and then the Althusserians. And that might be an interesting point of comparison, because it seems to me, in addition to the sociological nature of the our sort of individual institutions here, is also the fact that the American Academy is just huge compared to the British Academy or the Academy anywhere else. So in some sense, it can be self-perpetuating. You know, it's a different kind of space. Debates often don't come to an end, at least in the humanities.
Can I just add something to this? Where would you put someone like Fred Jameson, who did also teach at Yale at some point?
It's fascinating. He wrote the Political Unconscious there, but he doesn't figure in the spatial imaginary of it. So there's something about the discourse of deconstruction as theory that trumps who actually was where.
And Said.
Yeah.
But if you go, if you approach the issue in a sociological way, there's at least the possibility of some kind of focused comparison or contrast, and there's the contrast with Britain, or at least England, on that score. The question I have for Pheng is about not so much the term world as the term literature, because by the end of your talk, I was starting to chafe a bit and say, why literature? Why at this point, if you go with Heidegger this far, why not just say something like social signification? Much more broadly speaking, the meanings and the values that are not always explicit that we make as social beings. Sometimes using language, but not always grounded in language. Gestures and body language, and it's a metaphor. And if that's the case, then an earlier figure, slightly earlier figure, who had more or less the same intellectual adversaries as Heidegger, comes to mind, and that's Charles Sanders Peirce. They were both battling not only idealism, but also positivism. And I think Peirce's notion of the sign, with its kind of very subtle sense of causality, would end up being a lot more relevant, so that we get away from this idea that everything has to be seen along the lines of how we define literature or the literary.
Yeah, I'm just not familiar enough with Peirce's writings to be able to respond meaningfully. With Heidegger, the term that he uses is Bedeutsamkeit, meaningfulness. I guess significance is also another way. Yeah, significance is also one way to translate it. Then why the link between literature and meaningfulness? That's because perhaps because of their own formation. They also tended to privilege poetry, literature as disclosing the totality of meaningfulness.
But that's the thing that Srinivas is questioning. So that comes from a certain moment. It's defined. Why should we adopt Heidegger's blind spots?
That's true. But I think also if you look at, say, Chinese literature, there is also that link between, say, Taoist philosophy and the literary, right? But one would then have to do a larger comparative thing, and then it would really be collaborative work. Because I think, not a single person would possess all the different languages to be able to do that kind of study, right? But certainly if you look, the people I looked at, every single philosopher ended up talking about literature. Even someone like Hannah Arendt ended up talking about literature.
Carol.
The mention of the anxiety about the world and the construction reminds me of a funny episode of which I was witness in Urbino around the 90s, as you were mentioning. So Derrida had spoken, and when he finished, the English translator of the grammatology raised some questions and said, Jack, you speak always of things like the construction. You don't ask yourself how other culture would translate this notion. For instance, how the Chinese would understand the construction. So Derrida asked the assembly, is there any Chinese here? So a Chinese raised the hand. So Derrida says, tell us how the Chinese understand the construction. So the guy wrote in Chinese the word the construction in Chinese characters. Then Derrida said, well, read it. And the guy read, the construction.
Thank you. Yes, I think we will now break for lunch. Thank you all.
This has been a production of Cornell University. on the web at cornell.edu.